I'm probably a little bit late to the party on this one, but today we're going to talk about the brand new Tier 8 Premium Russian Super Heavy Cruiser Kronshtadt, which is the reward for the ongoing campaign. And initially, upon first playing this ship, I sort of thought it was a little bit mediocre. But then, as I was playing it and having mediocre games, I was asking myself the question, is the reason I'm having mediocre games because of the fact that the ship itself is really mediocre or underwhelming, or is it a skill issue on my part? And I think the answer is both. The Kronshtadt, as an overall cruiser package, is just kind of okay, but also it's not the easiest ship in the world ever to use. This game happens to be my best game in the Kronshtadt, and I think the fact that it's a terrible example of matchmaking of 5 versus 5, and I don't know why this has been happening lately at Tier 8 and Legendary Tier, but I keep getting put into all these tiny little matches with all PlayStation players. I don't know if people are turning off crossplay in order to get these smaller games. I don't know if less people are suddenly playing at Legendary Tier and Tier 8. I don't know what's going on. But I think the fact that this is a 5v5 game and we do so well in it sort of speaks to the idea that Kronshtadt will be quite good in ranked, although maybe it's not the best thing ever in standard battles. Anyway, what's the story on this ship? Well, much like the Azuma we're shooting at right now, the Kronshtadt has 305mm guns. These are really, if you think about it, battleship-sized guns because the Odin at Tier 7 has the same gun size. This puts Kronshtadt in the same league as Azuma, I suppose, and Alaska, just due to the gun size. There are 12 guns, and the AP is pretty phenomenally effective. It seems to penetrate things at any range, including battleships. It can even get big, juicy hits on them at the furthest of ranges. The problem is that the guns are woefully, in my opinion, inaccurate. I've been told that they have a 2.01 sigma value, which is fine, but the problem is they have battleship dispersion, specifically American battleship dispersion, which is a great dispersion pattern to have if you are an American battleship. Not so great if you're a heavy cruiser. And a lot of the time, it really does seem like you're shooting shotguns with these guns. They aren't very reliable, and frankly, I kind of find that frustrating to play on a cruiser. I don't mind so much if battleship shells are not supremely accurate, but it's a little bit of a different story when you're playing a cruiser. So you do have to get past the wonky accuracy. Although the guns reload fast enough that it sort of makes up for it, we're able to take out this Azuma as our first kill of the game. Next up on the Kronshtadt, we should talk about the armor. The side armor protecting the Citadel is thick enough to bounce high-caliber shells from pretty much any battleship you're going to face, but the bow and stern are both plated in 25mm of armor, meaning they can be overmatched by as low as 15-inch guns. And then the upper deck armor and the upper belt armor, both of these are 27mm. So they can bounce 15-inch guns, but they can be overmatched by 16-inch guns. And that causes this ship to be chunked quite a little bit. There's a lot of 16-inch guns you're going to be facing at Legendary Tier. Of course, the Kronshtadt can still angle against 16-inch guns, hoping to bounce them off its Citadel armor, its belt armor, but the upper belt armor, well, that can be overmatched. Luckily, there is a plate beneath the deck armor and the upper belt armor that protects the top of the Citadel. I think it's 90mm, so even if the first layer of armor can be overmatched by 15-inch guns, it's unlikely that those 15-inch guns will actually Citadel you unless you give flat broadside. Still, they can get chunky penetrations with their AP. And then Well, we have radar on the Kronshtadt. It's 11.7 kilometer radar with a 15-second duration, pretty standard for Russians. Very good at smoking destroyers out. Not so great at ensuring they perish, because the Kronshtadt itself, I don't think it's the most effective cruiser known to mankind for dealing with destroyers. The guns are just not accurate enough. The AP doesn't really seem to do a whole lot to them when you shoot them, and the HE, well, I mean, it's fine enough, I suppose, but it doesn't have the biggest alpha strike in the world, and the shells are so inaccurate that every time you aim at a destroyer, sometimes only a couple shells are going to hit. So this ship might be good at, I suppose, smoking the destroyers out with the use of its radar, but it's not necessarily great at taking them down. Beyond the radar, it does of course get a heal and the fighter plane consumable, which isn't especially useful. And then, well, we need to get to the maneuverability, because that was my way into this ship. The maneuverability characteristics aren't very good. It's got like a top speed of 33 knots and a rudder shift somewhere around 14 seconds at base. And I found the cruiser pretty unfortunate to try to use with these maneuverability characteristics. So for my commander, I've actually gone for a choice that nobody thinks about. I've seen things or builds with people using Kuznetsov, Ivan B. Delightful, etc. Well, I've gone with Makarov, the more defensive Russian cruiser commander, and the reason for that is because Kuznetsov, Delightful, and all of those, they buff the guns, but they don't buff the guns enough. Even with those guys and accuracy inspirations, these guns are still inaccurate. The dispersion causes the shells to go everywhere, and so I decided at some point that I would just forget about speccing into the guns, and instead I would spec into the ship's maneuverability and survivability, and maybe get the reload down a little bit. So I'm using, I think, Mimbelli maybe as an inspiration. I honestly can't remember what my inspirations are at this point. I've been changing them around so much, but I settled on Makarov as the commander with the speed skills and the rudder shift skills active, as well as Ingenious because the turret traverse is pretty slow. And then for the mods, I used the propulsion mod in the second slot, and instead of concealment, I went with steering gears. This gives me like a 6-second rudder shift with this build and a 37 knot speed. Allows me to get around the battlefield a lot quicker, and allows me to turn the ship to angle its armor much more easily and much more effectively against battleships and the like. And I think it allows me to get into positions where I can sort of brawl. You'll notice that during the course of this game, we've taken our engagements at mostly very close range, and I think the Kronshtadt is actually pretty good at close range. It sort of reminds me a little bit of a German battleship in the sense that I think earlier on in the game, when all the enemy ships are still alive, you probably want to play it at range a little bit more, utilizing the AP and more of the HE, but then you want to look for opportunities to sort of push this ship in aggressively, because it can rip things apart. Cruisers and battleships at close range. You just can't really get into close range at the very beginning of the battle, and you do have to exercise patience with this thing. And in these kind of scenarios, it is actually a pretty good ship, and it's pretty unique. I don't think the other two sort of soupy heavy cruisers, Alaska and Azuma, play very much like this at all. The Kronshtadt is much more of a brawler, really, I'd say, than either of those two. And both of them, frankly, seem to have more accurate guns. I think, by the way, with his Z-23, you can sort of see here how this ship isn't the best at dealing with destroyers. The reload is just so slow, and the AP and HE alphas aren't all that impressive when it comes to taking out destroyers. I mean, we were able to take out that, whatever that was, the Z-46 or the Z-23, the German DD, we were ultimately able to sink him, but only because he stood there and sort of let us. If you've got a destroyer that's actually trying to get away, It's a little bit harder, and the wonky shell dispersion does make it somewhat frustrating. Personally, though, I think this ship is certainly unique and okay, and sometimes fun to play, but really it's not my cup of tea. It's not my favorite campaign ship that has been released, but if you enjoy the unique experience of these super heavy cruisers and you're looking for something that really doesn't play anything like the other alternatives we have, those being Alaska and Zuma, then Kronshtadt might scratch that itch for you, but you might find that the rather horrific gun accuracy sort of holds it back and makes you maybe not want to play it so much. At least that is the boat that I'm in. But it's certainly not a terrible ship. It's somewhat underwhelming. Sort of feels to me like a campaign ship they just stuck in there because they needed a campaign ship for this update in order to tide them over to the next update where they can, make something a little bit bigger. But I think this was a pretty good game on the Kronstadt's part that demonstrates it well enough. Hope you enjoyed it. If so, give it a thumbs up, consider subscribing if you haven't already, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.